Migration still remains a really significant part of Australian and Aboriginal history. Young in 2009 defined the Stolen Generation as a time under which white Australia and assimilation policies in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were not of full blood were encouraged to become assimilated into a broader society in an attempt to eventually create a society which was to fit the European standards and needs. And this included and involved not having Aboriginal people and their colour and their race as a part of society. By doing this, children were often forcibly removed from their families, and this has brought on significant distress for families and children and people of this Aboriginal culture and Indigenous community. Through growing up and through generations and generations, there's been ongoing needs and issues that have risen as a result of what had happened to them during this time of the Stolen Generations. Their land, their culture, and their families were taken away from them, and they are such crucial elements of Indigenous history and their culture. So it's important to understand Aboriginal culture and their beliefs and their values as these shape who they are and who they become, but they also help as teachers for us to identify what needs to be in place to allow students to excel and to grow, and these are the sorts of things that help that happen. So analysing the nature and effects and the impacts of the event or practice on Indigenous Australians today. So the Stolen Generations, as I said, has had a huge impact on Indigenous culture. Mental health is an issue that is being brought to light, and psychiatrist Dr. Raphael highlighted that mental health has been really significant due to the Stolen Generations, and this is due to the removal of Indigenous children has produced the background for many years of horrific memories and distress and mental health problems that still need to be addressed. Indigenous Australians also face social and economic disadvantage, violence and abuse, substance problems, and life stresses due to this separation from their Indigenous families and their culture. It was pointed out that Aboriginal well-being is intrinsically linked to the relational bonds to their families and the community, and these relational bonds are really strong for Indigenous people and their cultures. So therefore, the loss of these bonds during the Stolen Generations was really affecting their mental health and is continued to as generations have gone past. Substance abuse and violence, as Hunter in 1991 described, that high rates of alcohol abuse, inter and intracultural violence, and also more recently high rates of attempted and successful suicide. These have stemmed from acculturation and violence inflicted on Aboriginal culture by white culture through massacres and the Stolen Generations. Social problems have also come to light due to the Stolen Generations and the effect that this has had. Also, Lino in 2010, he highlighted that the removal policies in the Stolen Generations have also affected Indigenous education. In the grim statistics, it is included that Indigenous disadvantage is low, and they also have low levels of literacy, numeracy and education, but also low levels of financial literacy. So with this in mind, reflecting on this and the relevance of educators understanding the Stolen Generations and the impact that this has had on students and their families and their grandparents, their history, their culture, their beliefs, it's really important to encourage Indigenous students to be proud of their culture and to provide them with opportunities to share their beliefs with other students. In doing this, Aboriginal students can contribute to the learning process, as Hewitt in 2000 suggested. that that the recognition of Aboriginal English as a valid means of communication can improve self-esteem, and its acceptance as a code of communication allows teachers to then encourage the use of standard English in situations where its use is expected. They have a high, Indigenous and Aboriginal Australians, they have a high importance on social relationships, their coexistence, and during this stolen generation time, they needed to depend on each other in order to stay strong, and so this is they feel as though there's no social order and they need everything. They trust that it's really important for everyone to be on the same page and the same level, and this is something that teachers really need to respect for Indigenous students in a classroom. Their physical world is broken up, or Aboriginal physical world is broken up into people, nature, land and time, and these are really important to them, but they're very different to how our curriculum and sometimes how our culture is broken up into, which is science, maths, English, geography, history. So it's important to be able to adapt for educators to adapt and include their important worldviews into our important worldviews. So the stolen generations contributes to a deeper understanding about teaching and learning with Indigenous cultures, and it does this through respecting Indigenous education in the school and what Indigenous students can bring to the learning environment. They are rich in history and rich in knowledge, and their family and their ancestors, their stories, their beliefs and everything are so important to Australian history. So it's important to be able to include that in the learning process, and you'll often find as a teacher that this can be beneficial for not only the students but the rest of the class, but also the community as well. Understanding their background and their history and what it is that it's important to them. Teaching the appropriate context, that's really important because often stories and materials can be misguided, and these certain stories and materials, when looking at the stolen generations and focusing on that, the underlying issues that went on during that time, there are specific texts and materials that can be more effective for students who may be presenting with issues that can come from what has happened during that stolen generation period. It's important to also to understand what is important from the students and their elders and their families and what their families believe, but also connecting with the community. So this can be Indigenous elders in the community can help to determine what is appropriate for it to teach for Indigenous students and children. Also gather artefacts that are relevant to the community. Teachers can often make biased and stereotypical judgments, and Vass in 2013, he proposed that teachers make judgments based on race, gender, class, physical ability, and this can always detract from the teaching and learning experience offered. So it's important as a teacher to understand, yes, all children are different and they learn in different ways and different environments, but it's important to be able to recognise this and then put forth strategies and ways of moving forward and dealing with a classroom full of different abilities, different races, different cultures, different beliefs, and being able to provide every student with the utmost opportunity to learn. So a school who would just focus on and only celebrate Aboriginal days through dot painting and stereotypical forms of celebrating Aboriginal culture is known as a tourist approach, and this approach is a stereotypical teaching of Aboriginal culture. So it is what we assume Aboriginal culture can be. We as a teacher may just assume that Aboriginal culture involves creating flags and dot painting, and this is often what we believe to know, but it can come across as quite disrespectful to Aboriginal culture. it's important to understand that Aboriginal culture differs in communities. So it has been found offensive in a local Aboriginal community that children, when they completed dot painting on a special day that was an Aboriginal cultural day, it was actually quite insensitive because that community does not celebrate or use dot painting as a form or a ways within their Aboriginal community. So it's important to use Aboriginal culture in the classroom every day rather than on special occasions. It's through telling stories in schools that Aboriginal people are performing a relationship to place, while children are learning to understand what a place might mean to the Aboriginal person telling the story. These interactions will also represent the unconscious work of reconciling Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children in schools. A great approach to use is an inquiry-based approach. And this is to avoid that tokenistic learning, as students can often not understand the meaning of dot painting as they don't really explore Indigenous education and perspectives in depth, which can be quite culturally insensitive. So traditional knowledge, histories, perspectives, and cultures of Indigenous people should be explored on a regular basis and also integrated into the curriculum to allow all students a benefit and an opportunity to be able to learn about Aboriginal and Indigenous culture. So I hope that it is better understood that the stolen generations and the impact that the stolen generations has had on Indigenous students, but their families and their ancestors, and the importance of understanding this background and bringing it into the classroom and highlighting it to students that there's opportunities for students to teach each other and to share their beliefs and to share their cultures to provide a culturally rich classroom. Thank you.